Today on the Gem Cutter's Craft, we're going to be addressing that age-old question. Crown first or pavilion first? Today's topic is a fan-submitted question. So this one comes from Nick Wolf. Nick says, do you mind if I pick your brain on a subject recently brought up in a group? It's on pavilion versus crown first. What's your weigh-in on that? Now, I was all ready to send him a video that I had previously made about this topic because surely it's such an obvious question that I've already made a video on this, and I was surprised to discover that I had not. So today is that day. Let us begin a new year with an age-old question. So, when we're faceting a stone, we have two ways to approach it. We can cut the crown first, or we can cut the pavilion first. Now, let's rewind a little bit, a couple years. I did a video where I talked about the development of the American faceting technique. Now, if you didn't see that two-part video, you might want to go check it out. There's a link up above and below in the description. But let me just summarize it. Basically, that video says there is the entire world of gem cutting, which does crown first, and historically has always done crown first. And then there is America, which since the middle of the 1900s has been cutting, as a rule, pavilion first. And as we move forward in time, closer to today, the likelihood of an American or masked cutter cutting crown first has become almost to the point of non-existent. So today, typically when we would look at an American cutter or someone else in the world that's using an American machine, a masked machine with a masked technique, they're probably going to do pavilion first. So American and everybody else. So I want to talk about these two and just talk about the pros and the cons, because at the end of the day, you're the cutter and it's up to you which way you want to proceed with your stone, but it's kind of good to know the pros and cons of each. So let's start with crown first, since that's the oldest technique. So when we cut crown first, we start with the girdle. Always. So if you're cutting a round, you make a round shape. If you're cutting an oval, you'll hand make an oval shape. If you're cutting an emerald cut, you'll make an emerald cut and measure all the corners and make sure that everything's straight before we do anything else. So crown first means outline shape first. That's how we begin. So we start out with a girdle shape, and then typically we're going to cut in our main. So in the case of the round brilliant, like this model, we've got 8 main facets, but this could also be an oval brilliant top or a cushion brilliant top, or an emerald cut top, or a step cut rectangle. Whatever design we're going to make, start with the outline, we'll cut in the first tier of mains. So in this case, 8 main facets. Then typically we're going to cut the table in right there if we haven't already cut the table before we cut the mains. So now we've got a girdle hard reference point, a table hard reference point, and a main facet that can be adjusted to fit into the shape of our preform. By the way, crown first, we always do a preform. Typically. Always. Typically. Always. No. So these 2 reference points, and then our main can be adjusted as need be. Maybe it's 35 degrees for a classic. Maybe it's slightly shallower at 30 or 25. Maybe it's super deep at 40. But we've got some reference points to work off of. Once the mains are in, we can do the stars and the breaks, or the breaks and the stars, however you want to do it. Polish it, flip it over, and then cut the bottom. Typically, the bottom is going to be a step cut, so tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, maybe tier 4. Or in the case of a brilliant cut, we do the 8 mains again, balance them with the Q-lip point, make sure the girdle's level, and then we'd put the break facets in. So that's crown first. Let's talk about pavilion first. Pavilion first is the other way around. So we'll typically, and the round brilliant is the most idealized model to use this for. So in the pavilion first model, which is also the meat point technique model, we're going to start with the Q-lip point. 8 main facets, then we're going to facet in our girdle, or maybe we'll hand spin in our girdle, but we typically will always start with the Q-lip point. Then we're going to put in the breaks, then we're going to flip the stone over, and then we're going to use the faceted girdle or the break lines on the bottom to cut the breaks on top, and then the mains that split them in half, and then the stars that split the mains in half. So everything's very nice and tidy and even. Those are the 2 techniques. Crown first, pavilion first. Now let's talk about pros and cons, because this is really what this video is all about. For the crown first technique, We're starting with the main facets. We already have our girdle shape in. And let's just keep using the round as a good example because this doesn't exactly apply to something like an emerald cut, but any kind of brilliant top. Ovals, cushions, pears, rounds. Having the girdle means that you have made your outline shape perfectly match your ruff. So if your ruff was meant to be an oval, you've made it into the perfect oval for that shape. Length, width, shoulders, and whatever else. You've preformed in the height, so you know that you don't have a problem with closing your window, making good reflection. So we know that our proportions well, height-wise, length, width, shoulders-wise. Now here's a benefit of starting with the crown first. If we're gonna do a round brilliant, for example, we put in our 8 mains, and then we put in our table. Now, we don't have any reference points right now. We don't have any meet points yet. There's just 8 little squares here and a table. But having those 8 squares around the table means we can use the table as a reference point to see if all the facets are the same size. In the round brilliant shape, those 8 facets of the mains makes the table look like a perfect octagon. So it's very easy to look at that octagon and see, is it misshapen? Is it skewed? Is it off center? All of those things tell you that your mains aren't balanced. We can also look at the girdle line and see, are all of our swoops to the same depth? Or is the girdle looking tilted one way or the other? That also tells you if your mains are balanced. Now, if we try to do the exact same thing on the other side, no problem with the round brilliant. We cut all 8 mains to a point, mains are balanced. But here's where the problem comes in. What if it's an oval? What if it's a step cut? Could be an oval step cut or a square or emerald step cut. How do you balance your 8 mains when you don't have a cullet point? You do them by eye. But the problem is that when you have this point sticking up at you, that's your preform point, your eye has a really hard time looking at those 8 mains because there's so much depth between the girdle line and the cullet point or the keel line or your preform elevation that it's very difficult for your eye. It gets confused, it gets lost trying to see the facets, and it's pretty difficult to make sure that they're all perfect. There's no table reference point to help you out, which makes it much, much harder. Not impossible, but unpleasant. So that's our first pro for crown first. Having the table there helps you balance your 8 mains so you know everything's even. So if you've got a long stone or a short stone or a round stone, you can still use your table to help you see the proportions, see the shape. Having the table there also helps you when you're improvising because if you need to stretch the design out because your oval's longer or shorter than whatever you think it's supposed to be, having that table there helps you put the facets in the right place so that you can see how is the shape of the table changing and how are the facets spreading out. And just having that table there helps you have another reference point, which is always good when we're trying to invent a design on the fly. So our next pro for crown first, and this is one that I like a lot. When you cut the crown first and you finish the whole thing and then you go to transfer, you don't need a transfer block because your flat table can go to a flat dop with some super glue by eye. Easy. We do this in class. I've been doing this for years. I don't have a transfer block in my setup here at all. I don't use one. It's super easy, just one less thing that you need to have, one less thing that you have to buy, / one less thing that could be making your transfer or your whole cutting step sequence off. Because if your transfer block's a little off, if it's making the dots line up a little off, just one less variable we don't have to worry about. No transfer block, do it by eye, your eye gets really good. Third benefit of crown first. So as I said, crown first means girdle first. Girdle first means you are making the perfect outline shape for your ruff. It doesn't mean you're going to go on the internet and find a diagram that perfectly matches the shape of your stone because it doesn't exist. It means you're going to take the shape of your stone and hand tailor it, hand shape it, and make it as big as it possibly can be while still having enough height to make your crown and make your pavilion and close your window. So crown first is girdle first, and girdle first means better yield, typically. Now, what are some cons for the crown first technique? I would say one con is it doesn't work that well with the meet point technique. So if you've learned the technique where you cut a cullet point and then you facet in the girdle and then you split those in half with the breaks and then you flip it over and you use the girdle lines to make the breaks, to make the mains, to make the stars, to make the table, It's perfectly, that technique is made for Pavilion first. It was invented by Americans who cut Pavilion first. If you do it the other way around, it just doesn't work as well. It gets complicated with the table adapter because then now you've got to cut the table somewhere in the middle of the whole sequence. Your lines don't all perfectly line up, and you don't know if everything's perfectly centered on the dot because you haven't cut to your cullet point. We'll come back to this idea when we talk about Pavilion first, because that same process can also be a con for cutting Pavilion first. I would say another con of crown first is there's going to be more guesswork. If you're used to everything coming in perfectly to the diagram and every single meet point is perfect and lined up and you know exactly where to stop cutting because the meet points tell you, crown first is going to be more difficult because we're just not using the meet point technique anymore. We're cutting for real, by eye, with adjustments, with adaptations and changing the angle as we go and making the table as big as it needs to be for your rough, which means that your final stone does not exactly match your diagram if you were using a diagram as a reference. So I would call that a con if you're used to the meet point technique. So now let's talk about Pavilion first, pros and cons. So I would say the biggest pro of Pavilion first is that you can use the meet point technique. Cullet point, girdle, mains, breaks, flip it, and on and on. Super easy. For beginners, it's awesome. It's great. It's the most easy way to learn, especially if you're learning at home by a video, by YouTube, by a book, or however, by yourself. It's very straightforward. For me, that's basically the only pro that I can think of. It's easy. And if you're a beginner, it's easy. You can use the meet point technique. This is Editor Justin, and I just want to jump in right at this moment because I know somebody in the comments is going to say, hey, wait a second, one of the other benefits of Pavilion first is that we automatically always know that we can close our window because we do that first. It's the most important thing, and if we don't have enough height to do the crown correctly, we can just make the angle shallower at the last minute. But I don't accept this as a pro because in crown first, we always preform the stone. We always make sure that we have enough height, we have enough width, that we have enough everything. We maximize the stone. This is just basic level gem cutting skills, so I don't accept the importance of the Pavilion angle as a pro for this technique. Let's talk about the cons. And we kind of mentioned this already. This whole idea of the meet point technique and starting with the cullet point is great when your stone is round or square. It's not so great whenever it's an oval or a cushion or a pear, or an emerald cut. I had someone message me at the end of this last year saying, we're having the hardest time in my faceting guild trying to cut your emerald cut out of your book. And I'm thinking, oh, that's weird because it's a really easy cut. And they said, oh yeah, we're starting with the keel line and we can't figure out how far to cut. And it's just like, obviously, okay, yeah, you can't cut a step cut from the cullet point, from the keel line. It doesn't work. You have to start from the girdle and build up to it. There's building down, it doesn't make any sense. There's no meet points, there's no reference points. You need the girdle there in order to tell you how high to cut, how deep to cut. So if your stone design is not round or square, not 1-to-1 ratio, the meet point technique sort of falls apart. If you're trying to cut a step cut oval, it doesn't work. If you're trying to cut an emerald cut, it doesn't work. The only thing that you can do is make everything a brilliant cut with a point, an oval with a cullet point. It's not a great idea, but it's possible. A pear shape with a cullet point. Typically when we have step cut bottoms, which is most stones in my experience, we don't have a cullet point. And if you are using the step cut as your bottom design, there's no point where all the facets meet. So you cannot use the meet point technique to do long shapes when you do Pavilion first. That is a major problem. And it's no surprise that the majority of designs that we see on facet diagrams or out in the wild from American or American type cutters are center point, cullet, brilliant style bottoms. To me, this is the #1 biggest con of this whole video. If you can't make an oval shape or a pear shape or a cushion shape with your meet point technique, it's failed. We can't go through life only cutting stones with cullet points. It doesn't make any sense. The cullet point is the least efficient design for almost every type of material. It's not a good idea. If you're cutting a round sapphire, cutting with a cullet point, it doesn't make a lot of sense. If you're cutting a long emerald, cutting it with a culip point doesn't make any sense. If you're cutting a tourmaline, which is a long rectangle that has pleochroism, and potentially the secondary color is awful, making a culip point is the worst thing you can do for the color because you're going to mix the bad color in with the good color. So this is where the whole thing falls down for the meat point technique and for Pavilion First, is that it's very, very limited to culip points, and that's not good. Other cons, less flexibility. If you're going off a diagram, let's say you have my Secret Teachings book and you're looking at the oval brilliant. You want to make a culip point, but you want to do an oval. So you're trying to do the oval brilliant. But your stone is way longer or way shorter than the diagram in my book. That means we have to move the indexes around to make the design fit into our rough. Now, already this takes some experience and some advanced understanding of how to manipulate the design. But if you're cutting Pavilion First, you don't have the table to help you out. As I said before, not having the table and trying to improvise and stretch out the facets and stretch the design out is really a lot harder when you do it from the Pavilion First, because again, you don't have the culip point to help you out, and all you have to go on is the girdle. It's so easy to make a mistake that way. For me, I'm constantly jumping between looking at my girdle line to make sure everything's level and looking at my table to make sure everything's balanced no matter what design I'm doing. And I can't imagine cutting any other way, but you just don't have enough information to easily make a good cut without actually literally going in with a measurement loop and trying to measure all the facets, which takes way too long. Final con, if you're cutting Pavilion First, that means you've roughed in some flat table into your rough or your preform and you've dopped it flat table to flat dop. You're cutting your stone, maybe you're on the Pavilion side, first side, and your stone falls off. Now putting it back on is not that hard, flat to flat, it's easy, but the meat point technique really relies on the stone being perfectly centered. How do we know if we can put it back on perfectly centered? It's possible. I know you guys have tips and tricks to do this, but it's a whole lot of work. You got to get some blue tack and a target dop and a laser or whatever technique you've got. It's too much work. Having to rely on the stone being perfectly centered, scientifically perfectly centered, to me is already too much work because it just can't happen sometimes. Let's say you're doing a recut where you can't facet in the girdle the way that the meat point technique would like us to do to ensure that the stone is perfectly centered on the dop. You've got to just put it on there with whatever tricks or hacks you've got. And then if it's not perfectly centered, what are you going to do? So we're losing some flexibility by having to do it. If the stone falls off and we have to put it back on, it's pretty difficult. If the stone falls off on the second side when you're cutting the crown and you've got to put it back into your cone dop, it's not impossible. Of course, we put it in the transfer block and we put the cone dop down. It's just so much extra work. So to sum it all up, in my opinion, crown first, more flexibility, it's more generally used, and we don't need a transfer block. Pavilion First, great for beginners, great for circle or square stones, great for strictly following the meat point technique. So if you're a dedicated meat point cutter, then Pavilion First makes a lot of sense. Though again, if you're cutting ovals with step cut bottoms or pears or cushions with step cut bottoms, Pavilion First, I just don't see how it can work. It doesn't make a lot of logical sense. It makes more sense to start with the girdle and then build from there. So what do you think? Crown first? Pavilion first? I'd love to see a discussion in the comments. Let me know if you're a meat point cutter and you cut Pavilion first, or maybe you're a hybrid cutter and you do a sort of a meat point style, but you start with the crown, or maybe you've never heard of meat point and you're like, what is this dude even talking about? I'd love to hear from you guys. It's a pleasure to be back with you in the new year, talking about some of the hottest topics of gem cutting. Crown first or Pavilion first? What do you think? If you are enjoying these videos and these models and these books and these everything else's, I invite you to join me in the link below on my Patreon to help support the channel. With as little as a $3 a month contribution, you help keep all of these videos coming and free. And as an added bonus, every 2 weeks, you're going to get a 1+ hour podcast where I interview different cutters, jewelers, gemologists, and other people from the gemstone world, typically talking about cutting. to give you some more education, some more insight, some more things to think about in your journey towards becoming a great gem cutter. So I hope to see you on Patreon, and I hope to see you in person sometime here in 2025. This has been Justin K. Prim with the Gem Cutter's Craft, and I'll see you next time.